The radio crackled to life, static giving way to a clear voice that filled the barracks with impossible sound. Karl Hoffmann froze, cloth in hand, as the announcer's confident English cut through the evening silence. Around him, 30 German prisoners of war stopped their activities, eyes drawn to the small wooden box perched on the American guard's desk. The voice spoke of battles in France, of Allied advances, of German retreats, all with the casual authority of truth rather than propaganda. Some prisoners edged closer, straining to catch words they barely understood, while others backed away as though the device might burn them. Karl, once a communications officer with the Wehrmacht, recognized the technology but could not reconcile its presence here in a remote camp thousands of miles from the front lines. In Germany, radios had become increasingly restricted, many families forced to surrender them or hide them in attics. Yet here, the American Guard simply adjusted the dial, unconcerned, as if this miracle of information flowing freely through the air was ordinary as breathing. As the broadcast continued, Karl caught fragments of news that contradict everything he'd been told before capture. German cities under heavy bombardment, Allied forces pushing steadily eastward, Russian armies advancing from the other direction. No triumphant German counterattacks, no miracle weapons turning the tide. Just the steady, relentless drumbeat of defeat, broadcast without ceremony or embellishment. What struck him most wasn't just the content, but the mundane way it was delivered, as though truth required no special announcement, no furor speech, no dramatic music, just facts, flowing freely into every ear willing to listen. How was it possible, Karl wondered, that in the midst of the greatest conflict in human history, American soldiers could simply turn a dial and hear the world? The guard noticed the prisoner's attention and smiled faintly. "You boys want to hear the baseball scores next?" he asked, as casually as if offering a cigarette. Baseball, a game most Germans had never seen, discussed as though it were as important as the war itself. The radio crackled again as he changed stations, and suddenly music poured forth. Not the approved martial symphonies or folk songs of the Reich, but wild, swinging jazz that seemed to mock the very concept of order. Karl watched as one older prisoner winced and covered his ears, while a younger one unconsciously tapped his foot to the rhythm. In that moment, divided by a simple wooden box, the men were no longer just prisoners and captors. They were witnesses to two fundamentally different understandings of what information meant and who deserved to hear it. That night, as Karl lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, the sound of the radio continued to play in his mind. Back home, listening to foreign broadcasts could mean prison or worse. Here, they were as common as sunshine. He had been told America was chaotic, undisciplined, weak. But what kind of weakness allowed every citizen to hear every voice, while strength required silence? As sleep finally claimed him, one question lingered, unspoken but insistent. If they had been lied to about something as simple as a radio, what else might they have been told that wasn't true? The journey to this revelation had begun weeks earlier, when Karl and hundreds of other German prisoners arrived at the processing center in Virginia after capture in North Africa. They had prepared themselves for brutality, having been warned repeatedly by officers that Americans tortured prisoners for information and then executed them. Some men had hidden small poison capsules in their boots, resolved to die rather than face American interrogation. Karl himself had memorized only his name, rank, and service number, steeling himself against questions he would not answer. Instead, they encountered an efficient, almost mechanical process. American personnel checked them for weapons, photographed them, recorded their information, and handed out basic toiletries. Medical officers examined them briskly but thoroughly, treating wounds without comment. No one shouted, no one threatened. Translators spoke calm German, explaining procedures without ideology. The prisoners exchanged wary glances, expecting the true cruelty to begin once the processing ended. Yet hour after hour passed without incident. That first night in temporary barracks, exhaustion overwhelmed suspicion, and most men fell into deep sleep. Karl, however, remained awake, listening. What he heard confused him more than any interrogation might have. From the guards' quarters nearby came the unmistakable sound of a radio broadcast. News, music, then more news. The voices spoke freely about military operations, discussed political debates, even criticized their own commanders. All through the night, the radio played, jumping from station to station as guards changed shifts and preferences. By morning, the prisoners were loaded onto trains bound for camps deeper in the American heartland. As they traveled, Carl noticed radios everywhere, in station offices, in passing cars, playing from farmhouse windows. Each small town they passed seemed filled with these voices from the air. The Americans treated them as unremarkable, like running water or electric light. "They're deceiving us," muttered Werner Schmidt, a tank commander who had fought under Rommel. "These broadcasts are staged for our benefit. In reality, they must control information as tightly as we do." "Perhaps," Carl replied, "but why would they bother for prisoners? And how could they coordinate such a deception across an entire country?" Werner had no answer, but his eyes narrowed with suspicion as they passed yet another farmhouse where a radio played loudly enough for them to hear a woman singing about love and moonlight as if there were no war at all. When they arrived at Camp Crossville in Tennessee, the pattern continued. Radios appeared in guard towers, administration buildings, and recreation areas. News broadcasts interrupted music programs with updates from Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Weather reports predicted rain or sunshine. Advertisements promoted cigarettes, soap, and motor oil. And, most shockingly, comedy programs openly mocked political leaders, including President Roosevelt himself. What the prisoners could not fully comprehend was that by 1943, nearly 90% of American households owned at least one radio. The airwaves had become as essential to daily life as newspapers, connecting remote farms and crowded cities in an invisible network of shared experience. For Americans, this seemed natural. For German prisoners raised under Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, it was almost incomprehensible. One evening, as Carl worked in the camp kitchen, he watched an American sergeant place a small portable radio on a shelf and tune it to a news broadcast. The announcer described setbacks for German forces near Stalingrad, with neither triumph nor scorn, just the measured tones of a man reading facts. When Carl accidentally dropped a pot, causing a loud clang, the sergeant glanced over. "You understand English?" he asked. Carl hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Bad news for your side today," the sergeant said, but without malice. "War's taking a turn." "That is what your radio says," Carl replied carefully. The sergeant laughed. "It's what all the radios say. CBS, NBC, Mutual Broadcasting, they all get the same reports. If one tried to lie, the others would call them out." This concept, competing sources checking each other, seemed alien to Carl, whose experience with German radio meant a single, controlled voice of authority. Before he could respond, the broadcast switched to a cigarette advertisement, followed by a comedy program where a man with a nasal voice told jokes about rationing that made the kitchen staff laugh. No one seemed concerned that prisoners might hear news or entertainment. Information flowed as freely as the coffee in their cups. That night, Carl whispered to his bunkmate, Heinrich Müller, "Have you noticed? They let their broadcasts criticize their own government, mention military failures, debate politics openly. How can they win a war with such chaos?" Heinrich, who had been a university student before joining the Wehrmacht, whispered back, "Perhaps this is not chaos, but something else. Something we've forgotten how to recognize." The idea lingered between them, uncomfortable and unresolved. What they were witnessing challenged fundamental assumptions about order, control, and national strength. If a country could permit such openness and still mobilize for war, then what did that say about the necessity of the tight controls they had accepted back home? Neither man had answers, but the questions themselves felt dangerous. As weeks passed and the prisoners settled into camp routine, the omnipresence of radio became even more apparent. On Sundays, guards gathered to hear baseball games, cheering and groaning as distant voices described men hitting balls with sticks in stadiums they would never see. During mealtimes, news programs provided updates from around the world, casually mentioning bombing raids over German cities as though reporting rainfall. In the evenings, families gathered around the big wooden consoles in homes visible beyond the fences, listening to drama programs that transported them to other worlds. What struck Carl most forcefully was how ordinary it all seemed to the Americans. Radio wasn't a privilege or a controlled channel of authority. It was simply there, like air or water, available to anyone who wished to listen. When he finally found the courage to ask a guard about this, the man seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "What do you mean, who's allowed to listen? Anybody with a radio, I guess. My grandma back in Ohio keeps hers on all day. Says it's like having company in the house." "But who decides what news is broadcast?" Carl pressed. The guard shrugged. "The networks, I suppose. They get reports from correspondents, wire services, military briefings. And your government permits this, even criticisms?" The guard looked at him strangely. "That's kind of the whole point, isn't it? What would be the use of fighting if we gave up the very things we're fighting for?" The conversation troubled Carl deeply. In Germany, the Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, had been promoted as a technological marvel, bringing the nation together. But its real purpose was control. Designed to receive only domestic broadcasts and priced affordably, it ensured that German families heard only approved messages. Foreign stations were increasingly jammed, and listening to them became a crime, punishable by imprisonment. Radio in the Reich had become a tool of unification through isolation. Here, radio seemed to serve the opposite purpose, connecting Americans not only to each other, but to the wider world in all its complexity and contradiction. News, entertainment, education, debate, all flowing freely through the air to anyone who cared to listen. How could a nation function this way, especially during wartime? Yet America was not merely functioning, but producing on a scale that had overwhelmed German forces across 2 continents. The evidence confronted them daily. Camp Crossville processed thousands of pounds of food weekly, much of it grown locally, but some shipped from across the country. Power lines stretched to remote farmhouses. Trucks and trains moved constantly, visible from the camp perimeter. And everywhere, the invisible web of radio waves connected it all, coordinating this vast enterprise not through command, but through shared information. Friedrich Bauer, a former Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down over the Mediterranean, expressed what many prisoners felt, but few articulated. "We were told America was soft, divided, inefficient, that democracy made them weak. Yet look at what surrounds us: abundance in wartime, organization without fear, and information flowing freely. This is not weakness. It is a kind of strength we were taught to despise, but never truly understood." Some prisoners refused such reflections, withdrawing into rigid adherence to what they had been taught. They dismissed what they saw as elaborate deception, or attributed American success to material resources rather than systemic advantages. Others, like Carl, found themselves increasingly troubled by the contradictions between expectation and reality. The camp commandant, Colonel James Pearson, seemed to understand this inner conflict. A veteran of the previous war who had studied in Germany during the 20s, he occasionally visited the barracks and spoke with prisoners in halting German. During one such conversation, he noticed Carl listening to a guard's radio. "You find our broadcasts interesting?" he asked. Carl hesitated, then nodded. "They are different from what we have at home." "Different how?" "More voices, more disagreement, even about the war itself." The colonel considered this. "When I was in Munich in 1923, German radio was just beginning. People were excited about its possibilities. They saw it as a way to rebuild cultural unity after the war. I wonder when that changed, when it became about control rather than connection." Carl had no answer. He had been a child when Hitler came to power, had grown up with the Volksempfänger's familiar voice setting the rhythm of national life. He could barely remember a time before radio meant a single, authorized version of reality. The colonel gestured to the small portable set playing nearby. "One of my men keeps a log of German broadcasts we managed to pick up. They mentioned victories that never happened, offensives that failed weeks ago. They speak of inevitable triumph while your forces retreat on 3 fronts. Does that strike you as strange? It did, but Carl couldn't bring himself to say so directly. Instead, he asked, "Why tell us this? We are your enemies." "Are you?" The colonel looked thoughtful. "Or are you men who were told a story about your country, about ours, that turns out not to be entirely true?" He left Carl with that uncomfortable question hanging in the air, as the radio nearby advertised a soap that promised to leave clothes whiter than white, an absurd concern in a world at war, yet somehow reassuring in its mundane normality. The technological reality behind these broadcasts fascinated the prisoners with technical backgrounds. Carl, who had worked with military communications equipment, found himself explaining to others how the American radio system functioned. The country had developed a vast network of transmission towers, some broadcasting at 50,000 watts, powerful enough to reach across multiple states. These were connected to studios in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, where programs were produced and distributed nationally. More remarkable still were the portable radios that guards carried casually, small enough to fit in a large pocket, powered by batteries, able to pull voices from the air anywhere. The engineering required to miniaturize vacuum tubes and circuitry to this degree was impressive, especially on a scale that made such devices common rather than rare. Hans Weber, who had been an electrical engineer in Frankfurt before the war, examined one such radio when a guard allowed him to repair it. "The components are not necessarily better than ours," he admitted later, "but they are mass-produced with remarkable consistency. And the design prioritizes accessibility over control, any station available at the turn of a dial." This technological accessibility reflected a deeper philosophical difference. German engineering had created the most advanced propaganda network in history, using radio to unify a nation through controlled information. American engineering had created a system that prioritized choice and range, even at the cost of centralized messaging. Both approaches revealed fundamental assumptions about citizens and their relationship to information. For prisoners raised to believe in the necessity of controlled messaging for national unity, the chaos of American airwaves initially seemed to confirm their beliefs about democratic weakness. How could a nation function when its own media criticized its leaders, reported setbacks, and offered competing perspectives? Yet as months passed, they observed no breakdown in American morale or war production. If anything, the openness seemed to strengthen rather than weaken resolve. One spring evening in 1944, as Carl worked in the camp office sorting mail, he overheard a radio report that stunned him. The broadcaster calmly announced that protest marches had occurred in several cities, with Americans demanding better conditions for black workers in defense plants. The report included quotes from protest leaders criticizing government policies, followed by responses from officials promising to address concerns. Carl waited for signs of alarm from the guards, for someone to shut off this seditious broadcast. None came. Instead, 2 officers nearby began discussing the issue casually, one arguing the protesters were right, the other suggesting they should wait until after the war. Neither seemed concerned about the conversation itself or that a prisoner might overhear. "Is this not dangerous?" Carl finally asked, unable to contain his confusion. "To allow such divisions to be broadcast during wartime?" The officers looked at him with genuine surprise. "More dangerous to pretend the problems don't exist," one replied. "That's how things fester. Besides," added the other, "what are we fighting for if not the right to argue about how to make things better?" This perspective was so alien to everything Carl had been taught about national unity and purpose that he struggled to process it. In Germany, such open division would be seen as weakness bordering on treason. Here, it was treated as the natural functioning of a healthy society, uncomfortable but necessary, like cleaning a wound to prevent infection. That night, as he lay awake, listening to the distant sound of yet another radio playing somewhere beyond the barracks, Carl confronted an uncomfortable truth.
The system he had been raised to believe represented strength, centralized control, single messaging, enforced unity, was being outperformed by one that embraced complexity, accepted contradiction, and trusted its citizens with information. If this was true about communication, what else might it be true about?
The impact of American radio culture extended beyond news and information. Entertainment programs provided glimpses into civilian life that humanized the enemy in ways that propaganda could never undo. Prisoners found themselves laughing at the same comedy shows as their guards, following the same serial dramas, humming the same popular songs. These shared cultural touchpoints created unexpected bridges across the barriers of language and conflict. Otto Müller, a former schoolteacher from Dresden, became an avid listener to a program called The Shadow, about a mysterious crime fighter who could cloud men's minds. When episodes aired, he would position himself near the guard's radio, listening intently and practicing his English comprehension. Eventually, one guard began translating parts he missed, and soon they were discussing plot developments as though they were simply two fans rather than captor and captive. Music proved even more powerful. Big band broadcasts filled the air with sounds that had been increasingly banned in Germany as degenerate, particularly jazz with its African-American roots. Many prisoners initially recoiled from these unfamiliar rhythms, finding them chaotic or primitive. Yet, as months passed, some found themselves drawn to the energy and emotion in the music, especially younger men who had been teenagers when cultural restrictions began. Karl noticed one such transformation in his bunkmate, Friedrich, who at first covered his ears whenever jazz played nearby. Gradually, Friedrich's resistance softened. Karl caught him tapping his foot to Duke Ellington's orchestra, then humming Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. When asked about this change, Friedrich seemed embarrassed. "It reminds me of dancing with Margaret before the war," he admitted quietly. "Before everything became so rigid." These small human connections through shared cultural experience complicated the neat divisions of enemy and ally, superior and inferior. Radio brought American life into the camp not as propaganda, but as simply lived experience. Families gathering for Fibber McGee and Molly, farmers checking weather forecasts, housewives listening to soap operas while doing laundry. Ordinary moments made extraordinary by the contrast with the prisoners' previous understanding of their enemies. Perhaps most disorienting were the religious broadcasts that filled Sunday airwaves. Church services from various denominations, Bible readings, gospel music, all flowing freely in a nation that German propaganda had characterized as godless and materialistic. Catholic prisoners recognized familiar prayers and responses. Protestant ones heard hymns they knew from childhood. The comfort these broadcasts provided was complicated by the recognition that they had been told yet another falsehood about American life. "They told us religion was dying here," one prisoner remarked during a Sunday broadcast of a Methodist service. "Yet there are more church programs on their radio than we had in Germany." "They told us many things," another replied softly. As 1944 progressed, the news carried by those omnipresent radios grew increasingly difficult for the prisoners to hear. Allied landings in Normandy, German retreats across France, Soviet advances from the east, the steady bombing of German cities, all reported factually, without gloating or exaggeration, but with the clear implication that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Some prisoners refused to believe these reports, insisting they were propaganda, despite the consistency across different networks and the corroboration from newly arrived captives. Others sank into depression as the gap between what they had been promised, inevitable victory, and what seemed increasingly likely, inevitable defeat, grew too wide to bridge. Still others, like Karl, found themselves in the painful position of accepting that they had been fighting for a cause built on fundamental deceptions. One rainy afternoon, as a news broadcast detailed Allied bombing raids over Cologne, Karl's hometown, he found himself sitting alone by the barracks window, tears mixing with raindrops on the glass. A guard passing by noticed his distress and paused. "Bad news from home?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Karl nodded, unable to speak. The guard hesitated, then said, "My brother's a navigator on a B-17. I worry about him every day." He paused. "I hope your family is safe." This simple human acknowledgement that even enemies have loved ones, that suffering transcends battle lines, struck Karl with unexpected force. The guard moved on, but the moment lingered, another crack in the foundation of hatred and division that war required. That evening, as prisoners gathered in the mess hall, a radio broadcast brought unexpected news that silenced the room. An announcement about an assassination attempt against Hitler by German officers. Details were sparse, the outcome unclear, but the very fact of internal resistance at the highest levels of German military leadership was shocking to men who had been raised to believe in absolute loyalty. For hours afterward, the prisoners huddled in small groups, discussing the implications in hushed tones. If German officers had turned against Hitler, what did that mean for the cause they had fought for? Some denounced the conspirators as traitors. Others wondered aloud if they had seen something that soldiers on the front hadn't been permitted to recognize. Karl found himself remembering the colonel's question, "Are you my enemies? Or are you men who were told a story that turns out not to be entirely true?" The radio, that constant presence that had once seemed so strange, had become a window into a world beyond the camp. A world where information flowed freely, where contradiction was permitted, where citizens could hear all sides and form their own judgments. A world fundamentally different from the one they had been fighting to preserve. As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, the news from Europe grew increasingly grim for Germany. The prisoners listened as American forces crossed into Germany itself, as Russian armies approached from the east, as Hitler ordered desperate, futile counteroffensives. Some turned away from the radio, unable to bear the reports. Others listened obsessively, trying to piece together what was happening to their homeland. Karl found himself drawn to programs beyond the news, to music that reminded him of peacetime, to dramas that transported him away from the camp, to the simple human voices that filled the air with concerns both profound and trivial. In these broadcasts, he glimpsed a vision of what peace might mean, not just the absence of war, but the presence of ordinary life with all its complexity and contradiction. On Christmas Eve 1944, the camp commandant arranged for a special radio broadcast to be played throughout the compound. German Christmas carols, performed by a choir in New York, filled the air with familiar melodies that transported many prisoners instantly back to childhood memories of home. Men who had hardened themselves against emotion found tears streaming down their faces at these sounds from a world that seemed increasingly distant. Afterward, the broadcast switched to news. The Battle of the Bulge raging in the Ardennes, German forces making a desperate final push that was already faltering. The juxtaposition of Christmas carols with reports of dying soldiers created a cognitive dissonance that many found unbearable. Some covered their ears, while others listened with resigned attention, as though bearing witness was all they could offer to distant countrymen. Karl sat on his bunk, radio sounds washing over him, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. Not just the physical journey from capture to this camp, but the mental one from certainty to doubt, from simplicity to complexity. The radio, that small wooden box that had first seemed so strange and threatening, had become a kind of teacher, introducing him to a world where information wasn't controlled but shared, where disagreement wasn't weakness but strength. As the new year dawned, bringing reports of further Allied advances and German collapses, Karl found himself wondering what would remain when the fighting finally ended. Not just of cities and infrastructure, but of beliefs and certainties. What would men like him, raised on absolute truths that proved conditional, on promises that went unfulfilled, build from the ruins of their former convictions? One cold February morning, Karl was assigned to office duty, filing prisoner records. As he worked, a radio played nearby, broadcasting a speech by President Roosevelt about the recent Yalta Conference. The president spoke frankly about disagreements among the Allies, about challenges in planning for peace, about the difficult balancing of competing interests. There was no triumphalism, no claim of perfect solutions. Just the honest assessment of a leader speaking directly to citizens he trusted with complexity.
Listening, Carl realized something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of strength and weakness, of what made nations and people resilient. The Germany he had fought for had demanded certainty, unity, and obedience. It had controlled information to maintain that illusion of strength. Yet here was America, allowing its leader to acknowledge problems unsolved and challenges ahead, broadcasting disagreements and difficulties alongside achievements and advances, and emerging victorious. Perhaps true strength lay not in enforced agreement, but in the capacity to hear all voices, to weigh conflicting evidence, to accept the messiness of reality rather than impose a simpler fiction. Perhaps a nation that trusted its citizens with information, all information, not just the convenient parts, was ultimately more resilient than one that feared what they might do with knowledge.
As spring brought news of Germany's collapse, Karl found himself less devastated than he might once have been. Something had been preserved that mattered more than military victory: the possibility of a world where information flowed freely, where voices spoke without fear, where ordinary people could hear the whole truth and still find reasons for hope. Years later, when Karl finally returned to a rebuilding Germany, he brought with him a small portable radio, a gift from a guard who had become something like a friend. On quiet evenings, he would tune it to distant stations, listening to voices from across a healing continent. And in those moments, he would remember his first encounter with American radio and how it had shown him that the most powerful technology is not that which controls what people hear, but that which allows them to listen to everything and decide for themselves what rings true. Perhaps, if we listen carefully enough to the voices around us, we might discover that understanding begins not with speaking, but with the courage to hear what others have been trying to tell us all along.